Brooklyn never imagined her wedding day would feel like a funeral. Forced to marry a cold, sterile billionaire she had never met, she stood at the altar in silence, literally. Mute since childhood, she became the unwanted bride of Ryan Miller, a man the world believed could never have children. Their marriage was a contract, nothing more. But 3 months later, when nausea hit her at a gala event and whispers began to spread, Brooklyn's secret became impossible to hide. She was pregnant, with twins. And Ryan's icy gaze held only one question: whose children are these? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, also click the super thanks button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us continue bringing stories that move you. Brooklyn never imagined that her wedding day would also be the day her freedom died. The morning began with the suffocating smell of white lilies filling every room of the Miller mansion. Flowers that, according to tradition, symbolized purity, but to her smelled like a funeral. She looked at her reflection in the mirror of the guest room where she'd been placed to get ready, and the young woman staring back seemed like a stranger. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of silk and French lace, so heavy it seemed to want to bury her in the ground. Each hand-sewn stone reflected the morning light like tiny frozen tears. Her grandfather, Dr. Chen, a respected Oriental medicine physician whose reputation crossed continents, entered the room without knocking. His steps were firm, determined, as they always had been. Brooklyn turned to him, and her eyes, the only instruments she possessed to communicate with the world, pleaded for an explanation, for mercy, for anything that would make this stop. But her grandfather's gaze was unyielding, carrying something she couldn't fully decipher. Was it duty, guilt, or perhaps a strange kind of love that manifests through cruel decisions? "Brooklyn," he said, his deep voice echoing in the silence of the room, "you'll understand one day. This marriage isn't about what you want now, it's about what you'll need in the future. Ryan Miller may seem cold, but he's a man of his word. And you need protection." Protection from what? She wanted to scream, but the words never came. Since the accident that took her voice at 6 years old, Brooklyn had learned that silence was both her prison and her only companion. She gestured frantically, her hands forming signs her grandfather pretended not to understand, or perhaps genuinely didn't. He'd never bothered to learn her language. The ceremony was held in the garden of the Miller estate, a place that seemed pulled from a dark fairy tale. Centuries-old trees curved over the aisle formed by white chairs, and rose petals fell softly driven by a cold autumn breeze. Each guest present wore perfectly fitted social masks, polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes, empty greetings, curious and sometimes pitying glances directed at the mute bride walking alone toward the altar. Ryan Miller stood there, still as a marble statue, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a perfectly cut tuxedo that accentuated every line of his body. But it was his face that held attention, or rather the absence of expression on it. His eyes were a stormy gray, cold as winter, and when they finally landed on Brooklyn, there was no recognition, no warmth. Just a clinical assessment, as if he were signing a business contract, not marrying a person. She walked toward him on trembling legs, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her. The sound of her steps on the petals was muffled, almost inaudible, but to her it sounded like drums announcing her sentence. When she finally stood beside Ryan, she could feel the heat emanating from his body, a stark contrast to the coldness of his gaze. He smelled of cedar wood and something more indefinable, power perhaps, or danger. The officiant began the ceremony, and the words became an incomprehensible blur to Brooklyn. She was hyper-aware of every detail, the rustling of leaves above them, the low murmur of guests, the sensation of the cold breeze against her exposed skin. When the moment for vows came, Ryan recited his with a deep, controlled voice, each word measured and empty of emotion. She couldn't speak her vows, so she simply nodded when prompted, her eyes fixed on the ground. The moment of the kiss was mechanical. Ryan leaned in, his hands touching her shoulders lightly, the first physical contact between them. His lips brushed hers for a fraction of a second, cold and distant, before pulling away. There was no spark, no connection. Just the fulfillment of a formality. The guests applauded politely, and Brooklyn felt tears sting her eyes, but she held them back with all her strength. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The reception was even worse. Brooklyn sat at the main table beside her new husband, who barely directed a word to her during the following 3 hours. He conversed with investors, greeted business partners, maintained that superficial smile that didn't reach his eyes. And her? She was decoration. The mute wife no one expected to contribute to any conversation. At one point, a socialite approached, looked at Brooklyn with false sympathy, and said loud enough for others to hear, "How brave of Mr. Miller to marry someone with limitations, true charity." Brooklyn felt her blood boil but kept her face neutral. Ryan, on the other hand, slowly turned his head toward the woman. His gaze was so icy she literally took a step back. "My wife," he said in a low, dangerous voice, "doesn't need a voice to be more eloquent than most people in this room, including you." The woman paled and quickly walked away. It was the only moment Ryan seemed to even acknowledge Brooklyn's existence as anything beyond an obligation. When night finally came to an end, they were led to the private wing of the Miller mansion. Brooklyn followed a maid to a luxurious room decorated in cream and gold tones. She expected Ryan to come, to fulfill what was expected of a marriage on the first night, but he didn't come. She heard his footsteps stop in front of the closed door, stay there for long minutes. She could feel his presence on the other side of the wood, and then walk away down the hallway. Alone, wearing a silk nightgown someone had prepared for her, Brooklyn sat on the edge of the enormous bed and finally allowed the tears to fall. She cried silently, as she always did, her shoulders shaking with sobs that made no sound. But what she didn't know was that Ryan hadn't completely left. He was on the other side of the hallway in his own room, but couldn't sleep. Something pulled him back. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was curiosity. He walked silently to Brooklyn's bedroom door, and finding it slightly ajar, peeked through the crack. What he saw made him freeze. She was sitting before the vanity mirror, slowly undoing the elaborate hairstyle they'd created for the wedding. With each pin she removed, strands of dark hair fell over her bare shoulders, and there was something devastatingly intimate about that simple act. The curve of her exposed neck, the delicacy of her movements, the palpable loneliness emanating from her, all of it struck Ryan in a way he wasn't prepared to feel. He should leave. He had no right to watch her like this, vulnerable and unaware of his presence. But his feet seemed cemented in place. There was something about her, that silent strength, that dignity despite everything, that stirred something deep within him, something he'd buried long ago. But then she turned her head slightly, and he quickly stepped away before she could see him. He locked himself in his own room, the image of her neck etched in his mind. And so the wedding day ended, without consummation, without words of comfort, without promises of a better future. But both in their respective rooms stayed awake until dawn, thinking of each other in ways they couldn't yet name. The first weeks of marriage were a careful dance of avoidance and inevitable encounters. Brooklyn woke every morning to the distant sound of the city awakening below, but inside the Miller mansion, the silence was deafening. The property was far too vast, with hallways that seemed to stretch infinitely, rooms that were never used, and an architectural coldness that perfectly mirrored its owner's temperament. She established a silent routine. She'd wake early, even before the maids began their tasks, and walk barefoot to the kitchen. The cold marble beneath her feet kept her anchored in reality. She'd prepare herbal tea, one of the few skills her grandfather had taught her, and sit in the small solarium adjacent to the kitchen, where morning light filtered through white linen curtains. There she'd watch the garden awaken, birds singing melodies she couldn't replicate, dew glistening on leaves, wind moving the branches of ancient trees. Ryan, she discovered, was also a creature of habit. He came downstairs always at 7:15 in the morning, impeccably dressed in suits that probably cost more than a car. His steps were firm, determined, and she could identify him by the rhythm. 3 quick steps, a brief pause, then more steps. It was as if he measured each movement with mathematical precision. In the first days, they didn't even greet each other. Ryan would grab his black coffee, always black, no sugar, no milk, and disappear into his office or leave for work. Brooklyn remained invisible, a ghostly presence inhabiting the same spaces without ever really occupying them. But coexistence, as cold as it was, created a mutual awareness that neither could ignore. The first change happened on a rainy Tuesday. Brooklyn was descending the main staircase when she slipped on the last step. Her heart raced, her arms flailed, seeking support, and then a firm hand caught her elbow, stabilizing her before she fell. Ryan. He was right behind her, and she hadn't even noticed. For an infinite moment they froze in that position, his hand warm against her skin through the thin sleeve of her dress, their bodies too close, breaths mingling. Brooklyn turned her face to thank him with her eyes and found his gaze already fixed on her. It was no longer that clinical, distant look from the wedding day. There was something different now. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. For 3 seconds that seemed to last an eternity. They just looked at each other. She noticed details she'd never paid attention to before. Small lines around his eyes that indicated constant worries. A softer shade of grey in his irises when the light hit at a certain angle. His jaw tensed as if he were constantly holding himself back. "Careful," Ryan finally said, his voice lower than normal, almost gentle. He released her arm slowly, but his fingers lingered a second longer than necessary, sliding softly across her skin before pulling away completely. Brooklyn nodded, feeling heat rise to her face. She descended the last step and went on her way, but she could feel his eyes following every movement until she disappeared through the kitchen door. When she finally looked back, he was still there, standing in the same place, with an expression she couldn't decipher. After that day, something subtly changed. Ryan began appearing for breakfast more frequently. They didn't talk, how could they, when she had no voice and he didn't know sign language, but they established non-verbal communication. He'd leave the newspaper on the table for her to read. She'd prepare extra tea and leave it in his cup. Small gestures that meant nothing and at the same time meant everything. One morning, Brooklyn was preparing a special medicinal tea, a recipe from her grandfather to strengthen the immune system, when Ryan entered the kitchen. She felt his presence before even seeing him, that energy he carried with him, intense and magnetic. He stopped beside her, watching the herbs she was mixing with genuine curiosity. "What's that?" he asked, his voice breaking the morning silence. Brooklyn grabbed a small notebook she always carried and wrote in delicate handwriting, "Medicinal tea, for immunity. My grandfather taught me." Ryan read the words and, for the first time since they'd met, she saw a slight smile touch the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a full smile, but it was something. "Your grandfather is a wise man," he said, and there was a tone of genuine respect in his voice. She finished preparing the tea and poured it into 2 porcelain cups, one for her, one for him. She extended the cup, and when Ryan took it, their fingers touched. It was a brief contact, accidental, but Brooklyn felt an electric current run through her arm. She looked up quickly and found his eyes already fixed on hers. This time, he didn't immediately look away. His gaze slowly descended from her face to land on her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. Brooklyn felt her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. It was something new, disturbing, dangerous. She looked away first, feeling her cheeks burn, and focused intently on the tea in front of her. Ryan took a sip, and she watched from the corner of her eye as he briefly closed his eyes, savoring the taste. "It's good," he said simply, but there was a weight to those 2 words that made it seem like he was saying much more. The following days were filled with these small moments. They began crossing paths more frequently in the hallways, brief touches as they passed each other, their shoulders brushing, murmured apologies followed by glances that lasted longer than they should. Brooklyn noticed that Ryan began adjusting his routine to coincide with hers. He'd appear in the library exactly when she was there, sit at the dinner table, even on days when he usually worked late. One night, Brooklyn was reading on the living room couch when Ryan arrived from work. Usually he went straight to the office, but this time he stopped at the room's entrance, watching her. She was curled up in a soft blanket, bare feet tucked underneath her body, completely absorbed in the book. The soft light from the lamp created delicate shadows on her face, and her hair fell loose over one shoulder. Ryan cleared his throat softly to announce his presence. Brooklyn looked up, surprised, and closed the book. He walked toward her, and for the first time sat on the same couch, not beside her but close enough that she could feel the weight of his body sinking into the cushions. "What are you reading?" he asked, gesturing to the book. She showed him the cover, Pride and Prejudice. "Jane Austen," Ryan said, and there was a tone of recognition in his voice. "My mother loved that book. She used to say the best loves begin with misunderstandings." Brooklyn quickly wrote in her notebook, "Do you believe that?" Ryan read the question and remained silent for a long moment, as if truly considering the answer. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I've never thought much about love. My life has always been about other things. Business, obligations, expectations. And now?" she wrote, surprised by her own boldness. He looked at her, and this time his gaze was different, deeper, more vulnerable. "Now, I'm starting to question many things." The moment was interrupted by a maid who entered to ask about dinner. Ryan stood up, the connection broken, but before leaving he turned and said, "You should smile more, Brooklyn. I'm sure it's beautiful." And then he was gone, leaving her alone with her heart beating irregularly and a question burning in her mind. What was happening between them? That night, lying in bed, Brooklyn couldn't stop thinking about every glance, every accidental touch, every unspoken word that hung in the air between them. She touched her own lips, remembering how his eyes had landed there that morning in the kitchen. And in his room, Ryan was also awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why the image of a woman he barely knew was occupying his every thought. The tension between them was growing, building like a storm on the horizon. And both knew that sooner or later, something would have to give. The storm arrived without warning on a Thursday night, bringing with it furious winds that shook the windows and torrential rain that turned the world outside into a grey, chaotic blur. Brooklyn was in her room, wearing an ivory silk robe, her hair still damp from the shower, when she heard a crash coming from downstairs. Her heart raced. Barefoot, she ran to the hallway and descended the stairs, guided by an instinct she didn't even know she possessed. The front door was open, slamming violently against the wall with each gust of wind. And there, staggering through the entrance, was Ryan. Drenched from head to toe, his expensive suit clinging to his body like a second skin, raindrops running down his face and hair. But what made Brooklyn freeze was his expression, or lack thereof. His normally alert eyes were half closed, his face pale with feverish patches on his cheeks, and he moved as if each step required monumental effort. "Ryan!" She tried to scream his name, but obviously no sound came out. She ran to him, grabbing his arm to support him before he fell. The heat emanating from his body was alarming, even through the wet clothes. He was burning with fever. "Brooklyn," he murmured, and there was a vulnerability in his voice she'd never heard before. "Sorry. I need to lie down." She put his arm over her shoulders, supporting his weight as best she could. He was much taller and heavier, but adrenaline gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. Together, stumbling and nearly falling twice, they managed to climb the stairs. Brooklyn guided him not to his own room but to hers. It was closer, and he clearly couldn't make it any farther. When she finally laid him on the bed, Ryan was already semi-conscious, murmuring incoherent things. Brooklyn ran to the bathroom, grabbed clean towels and a basin with warm water. Her limited training with her grandfather, helping him with consultations, learning about medicinal herbs and basic care, came to the surface. She knew she needed to bring his fever down before it became dangerous. With trembling hands, she began removing the soaked suit jacket. The heavy fabric clung stubbornly, and she had to pull hard, exposing the white shirt underneath, now translucent from water and stuck to his torso. Each movement revealed more of Ryan's physical form: broad, muscular shoulders, a defined chest, the line of his abdomen marked even under the wet shirt. Brooklyn swallowed hard. She'd never seen a man like this, so close, so exposed. Her hands hesitated over the shirt buttons. "I need to do this," she reminded herself. "He's sick. It's just medical care." But when her fingers touched the first button, she felt a wave of heat that had nothing to do with his fever. One by one, she unbuttoned the shirt, revealing the tanned skin underneath. There was a long scar running from the left side of his chest to his abdomen, probably from the accident that, according to what people said, had left him sterile. She traced the scar lightly with her fingers, feeling the different texture of the skin, and Ryan moved, letting out a low sigh. Pulling the shirt away completely, Brooklyn dipped the towel in warm water and began cleaning his body. She ran the towel over his neck, removing the raindrops, descended over his broad shoulders, over his chest where she could see his heart beating rapidly beneath the skin. Each pass of the towel was an intimate touch, an act that transcended medical care and became something deeper, more personal. Ryan moved occasionally, murmuring words she couldn't completely understand, but once she clearly heard, Don't leave me." Brooklyn's heart squeezed. Even in a delirious state, even burning with fever, there was a loneliness in those words that echoed her own. She continued cleaning, descending over his defined abdomen, and it was when she reached his pants waistband that she hesitated again. "I need to continue. The fever is throughout his body." With trembling fingers, she unbuttoned the pants and began lowering them slowly. Ryan wore dark boxer briefs, and even through the fabric, Brooklyn could see everything. Her face burned with embarrassment, but she couldn't stop now. That's when she noticed. As she ran the towel over his muscular thighs, cleaning carefully, Ryan reacted. Even unconscious, even lost in fever, his body responded to her proximity, to her touch. Brooklyn froze, her heart beating so loud she was sure he could hear it. She should stop. This was wrong. But something inside her, something primitive, something that had been repressed for so long, awakened. She looked at his face, eyes still closed, lips parted, complete vulnerability. He was at her mercy, and there was a power in that which was both frightening and intoxicating. Brooklyn put the towel aside, and almost as if in a trance, let her hands explore. She traced the line of his jaw, descended down his neck, felt the rapid pulse beneath her fingers. "Ryan," she whispered voicelessly, just moving her lips, knowing he couldn't hear her but needing to say it somehow. "What are you doing to me?" He moved again, and this time his eyes opened just a crack, so narrow she wasn't sure if he was really conscious. "Brooklyn," he murmured, and his hand rose tremblingly, touching her face. The touch was warm, feverish, but incredibly gentle. "You're here?" "Yes." She moved her lips, knowing he wouldn't understand, but unable to contain herself. "I'm here." And then, something happened that she didn't plan, didn't foresee, couldn't control. Maybe it was the forced intimacy of the moment. Maybe it was the weeks of accumulated tension. Maybe it was simply repressed desire finally finding an outlet. Brooklyn leaned in and pressed her lips against his neck, feeling the rapid pulse against her mouth. Ryan let out a low sound, half moan, half sigh, and his hand rose to her hair, intertwining his fingers in the dark strands. She continued kissing, descending down his chest, tasting the skin salty from rain and fever sweat. Each touch of her lips was a silent confession, each kiss a word she could never say aloud. When she finally reached his abdomen, Ryan arched slightly, and Brooklyn felt control slipping from both of them. She climbed back up, aligning her body with his, and when their lips finally met, it was as if the entire world disappeared. The kiss was hungry, desperate, charged with weeks of unreturned glances and unresolved tension. Ryan's hands, even trembling from fever, pulled her robe, exposing her shoulders. She didn't resist. In fact, she helped, letting the silk fabric slide to her waist. When their skin touched, chest against chest, heat against heat, Brooklyn felt something inside her break and rebuild at the same time. What followed was a confused mix of need and tenderness. Ryan seemed caught between consciousness and delirium, his movements sometimes assertive, other times hesitant, as if struggling to understand whether this was real or just a feverish dream. Brooklyn guided, took the initiative in ways she never imagined she would, driven by an instinct that transcended experience or knowledge. When they finally joined, it was with an intensity that left both breathless. It wasn't perfect. It was awkward in some moments, urgent in others, but it was real, visceral, and charged with an emotion neither was prepared to name. Ryan murmured her name repeatedly like a prayer, and Brooklyn responded with silent kisses, touching him with a reverence that spoke louder than any words could. Afterward, when their bodies finally relaxed, intertwined under the tangled sheets, Ryan fell into a deep sleep, the fever finally beginning to subside. Brooklyn stayed awake, lying beside him, watching his chest rise and fall with calmer breaths now. She traced the scar on his chest softly, and silent tears streamed down her face. What have I done? The weight of realization fell on her like an avalanche. She had taken advantage of him in a moment of vulnerability. He was sick, unconscious most of the time, and she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Brooklyn got up carefully, covering Ryan with the blanket before putting her robe back on. She looked at him one last time, so peaceful now, so different from the cold, distant man she knew, and felt her heart break into 1,000 pieces. She left the room silently, closing the door behind her, and went to the guest room at the end of the hallway. She lay down on the cold, empty bed, hugging a pillow, and let the tears flow freely. Meanwhile, in her room, Ryan slept deeply, but even in his dreams there was a soft smile on his lips, and neither knew that that night had changed everything, in ways they would only discover 3 months later. The days following that night were the most difficult of Brooklyn's life. She woke every morning with the crushing weight of guilt pressing on her chest, making it hard even to breathe. She avoided her own reflection in the mirror, unable to face the woman who had taken advantage of a vulnerable, sick, unconscious man. It didn't matter how many times she tried to rationalize. He had also participated. He had also responded. The truth remained unchanged. Ryan wasn't in a condition to consent, and she had crossed an unforgivable line. Ryan, on the other hand, didn't seem to remember anything. The morning after that night, he woke up in her room, a fact that clearly confused him. But when Brooklyn nervously entered to check how he was, bringing medicinal tea and medicine, he only thanked her formally, as he would any maid. His eyes contained no recognition of what they'd shared, no trace of memory of intertwined hands, desperate kisses, the intimacy that had marked Brooklyn forever. "Thank you for taking care of me," he said, his voice back to its professional, distant tone. "I don't remember how I got here. I must have lost consciousness." Brooklyn only nodded, unable to look directly at him. She wrote quickly in her notebook, "You had a very high fever. I called the doctor. He said you'd be fine with rest." It was a lie. She hadn't called any doctor. But how could she tell the truth? Ryan read the note and nodded. "You're very kind." And then, with a formal nod, he left, returning to his routine as if nothing had happened. And for him, indeed, nothing had happened. But for Brooklyn, that night had changed everything. She began deliberately withdrawing. She changed her morning routine to avoid crossing paths with him at breakfast. She ate in her room, claiming headaches through notes left for the maids. When they inevitably met in the hallways, she averted her gaze, quickened her pace, did everything to minimize any interaction. If Ryan noticed the change, he didn't comment, or perhaps simply didn't care enough to investigate. The weeks dragged on with this new, cold, distant dynamic. Brooklyn immersed herself in books, spent hours in the garden, anything to keep her mind occupied and away from the constant memory of that night. But at night, alone in her room, the memories assaulted her with vivid, relentless details. The heat of his skin against hers, the low sound he'd made when she kissed him, the way his fingers had intertwined in her hair. And then, 3 months later, the first sign. Brooklyn woke on a Sunday morning with overwhelming nausea. She ran to the bathroom and vomited violently, clinging to the edge of the toilet while her stomach churned. Initially, she thought it was something she'd eaten, but when it happened again on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, always in the morning, always with the same intensity, an icy fear began settling in her chest. No, it can't be. He's sterile. Everyone knows that. But the body doesn't lie. Besides the nausea, her breasts were tender. She felt constantly tired, and there was a strange sensation in her abdomen. Not exactly pain, but a new awareness of something growing there. With trembling hands, Brooklyn waited until the mansion was empty, then discreetly went out to buy pregnancy tests at a pharmacy on the other side of town, where no one would recognize her. Back in her room, she locked the door and took the first test. She waited the 3 longest minutes of her life, staring fixedly at the small result window. When the second line appeared, clear, undeniable, definitive. Brooklyn felt her legs weaken. She sat on the cold bathroom floor, the test still in her hand, and stared at it with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She took the second test. Positive. The third. Positive. All 5 tests in the box. All positive. I'm pregnant. I'm pregnant with Ryan's child. With the child of the man the entire world believes is sterile. The realization hit her in waves. First came the shock, pure, paralyzing, absolute. Then came the fear. What would happen when they found out? How would she explain? No one would believe Ryan was the father. Everyone would think she'd cheated, that she'd slept with another man. The shame and scandal would destroy not just her, but the Miller family's reputation. And lastly, buried under layers of terror and guilt, there was something more, something small but impossible to ignore. A spark of joy. She was carrying life inside her, a piece of Ryan, a piece of her, growing and developing, a miracle that shouldn't be possible. Brooklyn hid the tests at the bottom of a drawer, under clothes she rarely wore, and tried to continue with her life as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She began wearing looser clothes, avoided full-length mirrors, and planned every movement to minimize any chance of Ryan or the maids noticing anything different. For a few weeks, she managed to keep the secret. But then came the Miller family gala event, a social commitment impossible to avoid. The evening was impeccable. The 5-star hotel ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers, tables decorated with lavish floral arrangements, and guests dressed in their finest evening wear. Brooklyn wore a navy blue dress the maids had chosen for her, still elegant, but discreetly looser at the waist than would be appropriate. She stood beside Ryan, playing the role of obedient wife, smiling politely at strangers who greeted her with barely disguised falseness. Ryan, as always, was impeccable in his tuxedo. He'd placed his hand on the small of her back when they entered, a possessive gesture that made her heart race, but since then had moved away to talk with business partners and investors. She was alone in the middle of a crowd, the noise of conversations and laughter echoing around her like a distant buzz. That's when a waiter passed by offering drinks. Among the options was fresh apple juice, served in elegant glasses. The smell hit Brooklyn before she even saw it. Sweet, acidic, intense. Her stomach turned violently. She felt the blood drain from her face, cold sweat appearing on her forehead, and the room began to spin. Not here. Please, not here. But the body has its own rules. Brooklyn pressed a hand against her mouth and ran out, her high heels resonating against the marble floor as she desperately searched for the bathroom. She could feel the stairs following her, hear the murmurs beginning, but couldn't stop. She reached the women's bathroom just in time to push open a stall door and vomit violently. When she finally managed to compose herself, she cleaned her mouth with toilet paper and left the stall on trembling legs. She was washing her face at the sink when she heard voices on the other side of the door. Women talking in the hallway, their voices perfectly audible through the wood. Did you see? Ryan Miller's wife ran out like she was sick. Sick? Honey, that wasn't sickness. That was morning sickness, obviously. But that's impossible. Everyone knows Ryan Miller is sterile. That accident when he was 23, the doctors were very clear. Exactly. So whose baby is it? Malicious laughter echoed, and Brooklyn felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. Poor Ryan, married to a mute woman who's now apparently also unfaithful. What a scandal. I bet she thought she could hide it, as if no one would notice. Give it time. When the belly starts showing, there'll be no denying it. The Miller family will get rid of her so fast. Brooklyn leaned against the cold bathroom wall, silent tears streaming down her face. Everything was falling apart. The secret she'd tried so desperately to keep was being exposed, dissected, judged by strangers who knew nothing about the truth. She waited until the voices faded before leaving. When she finally returned to the ballroom, people looked at her differently. There was speculation in every glance, whispers following her every step. She found Ryan talking with a group of executives, and when he looked at her, there was a question in his eyes. He'd noticed her abrupt departure. Of course he had. He politely excused himself from the executives and walked to her, holding her elbow firmly. Are you okay? he asked quietly, only for her to hear, but there was something more in his voice. Concern, yes, but also suspicion. Brooklyn nodded quickly, writing in the small notebook she always carried. Just felt a little dizzy. I'm better now. Ryan studied her face for a long moment, his grey eyes penetrating as if they could see through all her lies. Let's go home, he finally said, and it wasn't a request. The ride back was made in tense silence. Brooklyn looked out the car window, watching the city lights pass in a blur, while Ryan kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But she could feel the tension emanating from him, the unasked questions hanging heavily in the air between them. When they arrived at the mansion, Brooklyn tried to go straight to her room, but Ryan's voice stopped her. Brooklyn, just her name. But there was a command in it that made her freeze. She turned slowly. He was standing in the middle of the hallway, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. We need to talk. Tomorrow morning, in my office. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Brooklyn nodded, feeling fear tighten her throat, and climbed the stairs to her room. She lay on the bed still dressed in the gala dress, one hand instinctively going to her still flat abdomen, protecting the secret that soon would no longer be a secret at all. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow he'll find out. And then everything will end. Brooklyn barely slept that night. She lay in the darkness of the room, watching the shadows of trees dance on the ceiling through the partially open curtains, while her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ryan's face, that unreadable expression in the hallway, the cold command in his voice. She knew what was coming. The confrontation was inevitable. And there was no answer she could give that wouldn't completely destroy her. At 6 in the morning, she gave up trying to sleep. She got up, took a long, hot shower, letting the water run over her body as if it could wash away the guilt and fear. She dressed carefully, a white silk blouse and black tailored pants, clothes that made her feel minimally in control, even when everything was falling apart. She pulled her hair into a low bun, applied light makeup to disguise the dark circles, and descended the stairs with silent steps. The mansion was quiet. The maids hadn't yet begun their morning routines. Brooklyn walked down the marble hallway until she reached the imposing door of Ryan's office. She stopped before it, her hand raised to knock but hesitated. This is the end, she thought. After this conversation, nothing will be the same. Before she could gather the courage to knock, the door opened. Ryan was there, already dressed impeccably in a charcoal grey suit, his hair still damp from a recent shower. He also hadn't slept. She could tell by the tension lines around his eyes, the clenched jaw. He took a step to the side, gesturing for her to enter, and Brooklyn obeyed on trembling legs. Ryan's office was a perfect reflection of his personality. Elegant, organized, intimidating. Mahogany shelves filled with business and law books, a huge dark wood desk covered with perfectly aligned documents, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the garden still shrouded in morning mist. Everything there screamed power and control. Ryan closed the door behind her, and the sound of the latch clicking echoed like a final sentence. He walked to his desk, but didn't sit. Instead, he stood there, his hands resting on the polished surface, his eyes fixed on Brooklyn with an intensity that made her want to disappear. "Sit down," he said, and his voice was too controlled, too calm, the kind of calm that comes before the storm. Brooklyn sat in one of the leather chairs before the desk, her hands clasped in her lap to hide the trembling. Ryan remained standing for a few more seconds, just looking at her, as if deciding where to begin. Then, slowly, he opened a desk drawer and withdrew something. A white envelope. He placed it on the desk, pushing it toward Brooklyn. She looked at the envelope with her heart in her throat, then looked at Ryan, not understanding. With an impatient gesture, he indicated she should open it. With trembling hands, Brooklyn took the envelope and removed the contents. It was a pregnancy test. Positive. Her blood froze. How did he get this? Then she remembered. She'd hidden the tests at the bottom of her bedroom drawer. He must have searched, or had someone search. It didn't matter how. He knew. "Are you going to explain this to me?" Ryan's voice was low, dangerously controlled. "Or are you going to keep pretending everything's fine?" Brooklyn looked at the test in her hands, unable to meet his eyes. She put the envelope back on the desk and grabbed her notebook. but her fingers were shaking so much she could barely hold the pen. "I was waiting for the right moment," Ryan continued, each word measured and precise like a scalpel. "Waiting to see if you'd tell me. But the days passed and you said nothing, so I decided to look for confirmation myself. And here it is." He tapped his fingers on the envelope, the sound echoing in the heavy silence of the office. Brooklyn forced herself to write, the letters coming out crooked and shaky. "I can explain." "Can you?" Ryan cut in, and for the first time there was emotion in his voice. Anger, pain, betrayal, all mixed in a contained explosion. "Then explain, Brooklyn. Explain how you're pregnant when I never touched you. Explain whose child this is, because it's certainly not mine." The words hit Brooklyn like physical blows. She raised her eyes to him, and what she saw there broke her heart. There was pain in that gaze. Genuine, raw, devastating pain. He really believed she'd betrayed him, and why wouldn't he? They'd never consummated the marriage, at least not in his memory. Brooklyn wrote quickly, her handwriting almost illegible from urgency. "The baby is yours, Ryan, I swear it's yours." Ryan read the words and let out a bitter laugh without humor. "Mine? Brooklyn, I'm sterile. The best doctors in the country told me that years ago. After the accident, the damage was irreversible. I can't have children, so don't insult me with lies." He began pacing back and forth across the office, hands clenched into fists, breathing heavily. Brooklyn had never seen him like this, so uncontrolled, so emotionally exposed. She wanted to scream the truth, tell him about that night, explain everything, but the words wouldn't come. How could she? How could she admit that she'd taken advantage of him when he was feverish, unconscious, vulnerable? "I trusted you," Ryan said suddenly, stopping before the window, his back to her. "When we got married, I knew it was a forced arrangement. I didn't expect love, didn't expect happiness, but I expected basic loyalty. I expected honesty." His voice broke on the last word, and Brooklyn felt tears burn her eyes. She stood up from the chair, took a few steps toward him, but stopped when he raised a hand in a warning gesture. "Don't," he said, still without turning. "Don't come near me now." Brooklyn went back to writing, tears now flowing freely down her face, staining the paper. "Please believe me, I would never betray you. The baby is yours. It has to be yours because I've never been with anyone else." Ryan finally turned, and when his eyes met hers, Brooklyn saw something worse than anger. She saw disappointment. "Then how do you explain it? How do you explain a pregnancy when I never touched you, Brooklyn? When we never shared a bed, were never intimate? Unless—" He stopped, and Brooklyn saw the exact moment a new understanding appeared on his face. "The night I was sick," he said slowly, as if putting together a puzzle. "I woke up in your room. You said I'd passed out, that you'd called the doctor, but there were no records of any medical visit. I checked." Brooklyn's heart raced. He was getting closer to the truth, piece by piece. "What happened that night, Brooklyn?" Ryan asked, his voice now lower, more dangerous. "What did you do while I was unconscious?" Brooklyn wrote with desperate hands. "You had a very high fever. I took care of you. I cleaned you, gave you medicine. You were delirious. And," Ryan pressed, walking toward her now, his eyes fixed on hers, "what else, Brooklyn?" She couldn't write. The words simply wouldn't come. And in her silence, Ryan found his answer. "You took advantage of me," he said, and his voice was full of painful disbelief. "When I was sick, vulnerable, without consciousness to consent at you—" "No," Brooklyn wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She shook her head frantically, writing so fast she could barely read. "It wasn't like that. You wanted it too. You touched me, kissed me, you—" "I was delirious with a fever of 104 degrees, Ryan exploded, his voice finally losing control. "I didn't know what I was doing, but you knew, Brooklyn. You were perfectly conscious, and yet—" He ran his hands over his face, his hair, breathing heavily. When he spoke again, his voice was broken, exhausted. I can't even look at you right now." He walked back to his desk, opened another drawer, and withdrew a different envelope, larger, official. He placed it on the desk next to the pregnancy test. "I've already made the arrangements," he said, his voice now completely empty of emotion. "You'll be transferred to a villa in the countryside. You'll have doctors, nurses, everything you need for a healthy pregnancy. When the babies are born—" "Babies?" Brooklyn wrote, confused. Twins, Ryan responded coldly. The doctor who was examining the maids noticed your symptoms and informed me. You're pregnant with twins. When they're born, we'll get divorced. You're free to rebuild your life, away from here, away from me. Brooklyn felt the world crumble around her. She grabbed the edge of the desk to keep from falling, tears now falling so abundantly she couldn't see properly. She wrote one last thing, the letters blurred by moisture. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Ryan read the words and looked away. You leave tomorrow, pack your things. It was an order, a sentence, an end. Brooklyn grabbed her notebook and left the office on wobbly legs. She walked down the hallway like a sleepwalker, climbed the stairs, locked herself in her room, and there, finally alone, she allowed herself to completely fall apart. She fell to her knees on the floor, silent sobs shaking her entire body, her hands instinctively protecting the abdomen where two small lives were growing, lives that were hers and Ryan's, whether he wanted to believe it or not. Twins, she thought through the tears. I'm carrying his children and he'll never believe they're his. On the other side of the mansion, locked in his office, Ryan sat in his chair, his head in his hands, his body trembling with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Pain, betrayal, confusion. And buried under all of it, something he refused to name, something that felt dangerously like a broken heart. He looked at the pregnancy test still on the desk, and his vision blurred. Why does it hurt so much? He asked himself. Why does the idea of her with another man destroy me like this, if our marriage was just an arrangement? But there was no answer. Only the silent, devastating pain of believing that the only person who had begun to touch his closed heart had betrayed him in the worst possible way. The villa where Brooklyn was sent was 3 hours by car from the city, nestled between green hills and surrounded by lavender fields that perfumed the air with a sweet, relaxing aroma. It was a place from fairy tales. Stone houses with slate roofs, narrow and winding cobblestone streets, a central square with an ancient fountain where children played and elderly people conversed. But for Brooklyn, it felt more like a gilded prison, an exile disguised as generosity. The house Ryan had arranged was absurdly luxurious by the village's standards. A spacious 2-story property with a private garden, large windows that let in abundant natural light, and comfortable furniture in pastel tones that should convey tranquility. There was a complete staff available. 2 nurses specialized in high-risk pregnancies, an obstetrician who visited 3 times a week, a cook who prepared balanced, nutritious meals, and even discreet security guards who patrolled the perimeter, supposedly to protect, but Brooklyn knew they also served to monitor. In the first days, Brooklyn barely left the room. She lay on the king-size bed covered with Egyptian linen sheets, staring at the ceiling, one hand always resting on the abdomen that was beginning to subtly round. The morning sickness was relentless. She vomited everything she tried to eat before noon, and the fatigue was so deep that sometimes she could barely stand for more than an hour straight. But the worst wasn't the physical discomfort. It was the loneliness. The deafening absence of Ryan, the man who had begun to constantly occupy her thoughts, whose cold gaze on that last day haunted her every night. She had destroyed any chance of something real between them. And now she was there, isolated, carrying his children while he believed they belonged to another man. 2 weeks after her arrival at the villa, Brooklyn was in the garden trying to read a book when she heard the sound of a car approaching. Her heart raced. Visitors were rare, and she wasn't expecting anyone. When the tall, familiar figure emerged from the black vehicle, Brooklyn felt the air escape from her lungs. Ryan. He was wearing casual clothes, dark jeans, and a navy blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong tanned forearms. Dark sunglasses hid his eyes, but the tension in his jaw was visible even from a distance. He stopped when he saw Brooklyn sitting on the garden bench, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then Ryan slowly removed his glasses, revealing those grey eyes Brooklyn saw in all her dreams, and walked toward her. There was no smile on his face, no cordiality, just that unreadable expression she'd learned to both fear and crave. "How are you?" he asked when he stood before her, hands in his pockets, body rigid. Brooklyn grabbed her ever-present notebook and wrote, "Fine. The doctors say the babies are healthy." Ryan read and nodded, looking away to the surrounding garden. Good, that's good. An awkward silence settled between them. Brooklyn didn't know what to say, what to write. Part of her wanted to plead again for forgiveness, to make him believe the truth. Another part wanted to run away, unable to bear being so close to him, and yet so distant. "I came to check if you have everything you need," Ryan finally said, his voice formal, professional, as if he were in a business meeting. "If there's anything missing, any unmet need." "I'm fine," she wrote, though it wasn't true. "Everyone here is very attentive." Ryan nodded. He stood there for a few more minutes, clearly uncomfortable, then turned to leave. But something made him stop. He looked back at Brooklyn, and for the first time since the confrontation, his eyes softened minimally. "Take care of yourself," he said quietly, and there was something in those two words, something that sounded almost like genuine concern. And then he was gone, leaving Brooklyn alone again, her heart tight and tears threatening to fall. But that visit was just the first. To her surprise, Ryan returned the following Friday, and the next, and the next. The visits became a routine. Every Friday afternoon he appeared, always with the same controlled expression, always maintaining physical distance. Initially, the conversations were brief and formal. He asked about her health, about the doctors, about any needs. She responded in short sentences in her notebook, never daring to hope for more than that. But as the weeks passed, something began to subtly change. Ryan began arriving earlier and leaving later. Instead of staying just a few minutes, he spent hours on the property. He walked with Brooklyn through the garden, one step behind her, never beside her, but present. Sometimes they sat on the bench under the cherry tree, and he read the newspaper while she knitted little clothes for the babies, an activity one of the nurses had taught her to occupy her restless hands. One day, Ryan arrived carrying a large box. Brooklyn looked at him curiously, and he, almost embarrassed, placed the box on the living room table. "Books," he explained. "I noticed you like to read. I thought, well, it must get boring here." Brooklyn opened the box with trembling hands and found at least 20 books, classic novels, some contemporary, a carefully selected mix. Tears stung her eyes. He had remembered. He had paid attention to her tastes. She wrote quickly, "Thank you. This means a lot." Ryan just nodded, looking away, but Brooklyn swore she saw a slight flush on his cheeks. The following Friday, he arrived with another gift, a portable music player already loaded with playlists. "Classical music," he explained, still avoiding looking directly at her. "I read it's good for babies in the womb, brain development and all that." With each visit, the walls Ryan had erected seemed to get a little less high. He began asking questions that went beyond medical protocol. He asked about her childhood, about how she'd lost her voice, about her dreams before the forced marriage, and Brooklyn, through carefully written words, began sharing pieces of herself she'd never shared with anyone. It was on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Ryan had decided to spend the entire weekend in the villa for the first time, that something fundamental changed between them. Brooklyn was in the kitchen trying to prepare tea when she felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. She let out a small moan, not audible, but the kind of guttural sound that comes from deep in the throat, and bent over the counter. Ryan, who was in the next room, heard and appeared instantly in the kitchen. "Brooklyn!" He was beside her in 2 steps, his hands holding her arms to support her. "What's wrong? Is it the baby? I'll call the doctor." She shook her head quickly, taking a deep breath. The pain was already passing, just one of the many discomforts of pregnancy. She wrote with a trembling hand, "I'm fine, just normal pain. The babies sometimes kick." Ryan read the words, but didn't immediately release her arm. His eyes studied her face intensely, looking for signs she was lying, that she was really in danger. And Brooklyn, feeling the warmth of his hands through the thin sleeve of her blouse, allowed herself to look directly at him. Really look, for the first time in weeks. "They kick?" Ryan asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Brooklyn nodded and, in an impulse she didn't plan, took his hand and placed it on her rounded abdomen. Ryan froze, his eyes widening, but he didn't pull his hand back. For a moment nothing happened, and then a small movement, a subtle pressure against his palm. "That was..." Ryan began, but the words died in his throat. He looked down to where his hand rested on Brooklyn's belly, and something in his expression broke. That carefully maintained mask of coldness cracked, and beneath it, Brooklyn saw wonder, confusion, and something that looked painfully like longing. "They're really there," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Alive, growing." Another kick, stronger this time, and Ryan let out a low laugh, a sound Brooklyn had never heard from him before. It was genuine, warm, amazed. He raised his eyes to meet hers, and for the first time since the confrontation there was no accusation there, just a raw vulnerability that made Brooklyn's heart race. "Brooklyn, he began, but then seemed to remember where he was, what had happened between them. He quickly pulled his hand back, taking a step backward, and the mask returned. "Sorry, I shouldn't have—" "It's okay," she wrote quickly, desperate not to lose that fragile moment of connection. But the moment had already passed. Ryan stepped away, ran his hands through his hair in a frustrated gesture, and murmured something about needing to make work calls. He disappeared into the guest room he used during visits, and Brooklyn was left alone in the kitchen, her hand still warm where his had been. That night, while lying in bed, she heard a sound coming from the hallway. Cautious footsteps, stopping before her door. She held her breath, waiting. After a long moment, the footsteps moved away, but Brooklyn knew Ryan had come to check if she was okay, and for the first time in months, she fell asleep with a small smile on her lips. Something was changing. Slowly, painfully slowly, but it was changing. Autumn had painted the village in shades of amber and crimson, leaves falling softly from the trees like natural confetti. Brooklyn was in her 5th month of pregnancy now, her belly prominent and impossible to hide, the twins' movements constant and comforting. Ryan had begun spending almost every weekend in the village, working remotely during the week and appearing religiously on Fridays. The tension between them had gradually softened, replaced by something more complex, a delicate dance of closeness and distance, of unspoken words and glances that lasted a second longer than they should. That Saturday morning, Ryan appeared earlier than normal, knocking on the door when the sun had barely fully risen. Brooklyn answered, still in her nightgown and robe, her hair falling in messy waves over her shoulders, her face still bearing the soft marks of the pillow. Ryan stood frozen in the entrance for a moment, looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher, before clearing his throat and looking away. "Sorry to show up so early," he said, running his hand through his hair. A gesture Brooklyn had learned meant nervousness. "But I thought, there's a new aquarium that opened in the neighboring town, about 40 minutes from here. I thought you might want to get out a bit, change the scenery." Brooklyn blinked in surprise. Since arriving at the villa, she'd only gone out for medical appointments, always accompanied by nurses and security guards. The idea of a normal, ordinary outing, almost like a date, made her heart race. She nodded enthusiastically and gestured that she needed a few minutes to get ready. 20 minutes later, she was sitting in the passenger seat of Ryan's car, a discreet black SUV, very different from the luxury cars he normally used in the city. She wore a light blue maternity dress that one of the nurses had bought for her, her hair tied in a loose ponytail, and for the first time in months she felt almost normal. Almost like an ordinary person going on an ordinary outing with whom? Her husband? A stranger? Something indefinable between the two. The drive was made in comfortable silence, soft music playing on the radio, the rural landscape passing by the windows. Brooklyn watched Ryan from the corner of her eye, the way his fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel, following the rhythm of the music, how his jaw relaxed when he thought she wasn't looking, the small wrinkle between his eyebrows that appeared whenever he was concentrated. She had memorized these details without realizing it, each small mannerism becoming precious and familiar. The aquarium was larger and more impressive than Brooklyn expected. Built in modern architecture with enormous glass panels, it housed thousands of marine species in tanks that replicated natural habitats. When they entered, Brooklyn felt a wave of wonder. The interior was dark and cool, illuminated only by the blue light from the tanks, creating an otherworldly, almost magical atmosphere. Ryan bought the tickets and, in a gesture that surprised both of them, offered his arm to Brooklyn. She hesitated only a second before linking her arm through his, feeling the firm muscles under his shirt sleeve, his warmth heating her side. They walked together through the aquarium corridors, stopping before each tank, watching in respectful silence. There was something deeply peaceful about that environment. Multicolored fish swam in synchronized schools, anemones danced with the artificial current, rays glided gracefully like underwater ghosts. Brooklyn was particularly fascinated by a seahorse tank. Delicate, impossible creatures, floating vertically in the water with hypnotic movements. Ryan leaned in to read the information plaque beside the tank. "It says here that it's the males who carry the offspring," he commented, a touch of surprise in his voice. "The females deposit the eggs in the male's pouch, and he carries them until they hatch. Interesting how nature sometimes reverses roles." Brooklyn wrote in the notebook she always carried, "Maybe nature knows that everyone should share the weight of creating life." Ryan read the words and remained silent for a long moment, staring fixedly at the seahorses. But Brooklyn had the feeling he wasn't really seeing them. There was something in his expression, a deep contemplation, perhaps even regret. They continued exploring, passing through glass tunnels where sharks and sea turtles swam above and around them, creating the illusion of being submerged in the ocean. It was in this tunnel, with the blue light playing on their faces and the aquatic world enveloping them, that Brooklyn realized something. She stopped abruptly, looking around with wide eyes, her breathing quickening. Ryan noticed immediately. "What's wrong? Are you feeling sick?" He held her shoulders, his face concerned. Brooklyn shook her head, but her hands trembled as she wrote, "I know this place. Not this aquarium exactly, but I've been in a place like this before. A long time ago." Ryan frowned. "When?" She closed her eyes, trying to pull the nebulous memory. "When I was 7, right after losing my voice. My grandfather brought me to the city for medical consultations. I got lost at the train station. I was terrified, trying to ask for help, but unable to speak. People ignored me or looked with pity and walked away." Brooklyn opened her eyes and looked directly at Ryan, but a young man stopped. He must have been about 15, 16 years old. When he saw I couldn't speak, he didn't walk away. He grabbed paper and a pen and asked me to write. He helped me find my grandfather. She paused, her heart beating out of rhythm as the memory became clearer. Before leaving, he did a strange thing. He gestured something with his hands, specific movements like a language. I didn't understand at the time, but years later, when I learned sign language, Brooklyn gestured slowly, forming the signs she'd seen on that distant day. "You're not alone." Ryan had become completely still, his face losing all color. His eyes were fixed on Brooklyn's hands, on the shapes she was creating in the air, and there was a devastating recognition in his expression. "So you were wearing a yellow dress," Ryan said quietly, his voice hoarse, almost inaudible. "With white flowers. Your hair was tied in 2 braids. You had a bandage on your left knee where you'd fallen." Brooklyn felt her entire world stop spinning. She looked at Ryan with wide eyes, tears beginning to form. "It was you," she wrote with trembling hands. "The young man who helped me. It was you." Ryan ran his hands over his face, and when he lowered them, there were tears in his eyes too. "I never forgot you," he confessed, his voice breaking. "From that day, the silent girl with the most expressive eyes I'd ever seen. You looked so scared, so lost, but there was a strength there too. A refusal to surrender to complete panic." He took a step closer, and Brooklyn could see every emotion passing through his face. Memory, recognition, something that looked painfully like long-guarded love. "I went home that night and learned the basics of sign language," Ryan continued. "I spent months studying, thinking maybe I'd see you again, that I could actually talk to you, but I never found you. You just disappeared." Brooklyn wrote quickly, tears now flowing freely. "We went back to our city that same night. I always wanted to thank that young man, but never knew how to find you, never knew that it was you. And then, years later," Ryan said, his voice becoming softer, more intimate, "when your grandfather approached me with the marriage proposal, when he showed me your photo, I recognized you immediately, the same eyes, the same expression. He stopped, struggling with the words. "I accepted the marriage not out of obligation or family arrangement. I accepted it because it was you. Because I spent years wondering what had happened to the girl from the train station." And suddenly there you were, needing me again. How could I refuse? Brooklyn was openly crying now, silent sobs shaking her shoulders. Ryan reached out and, with devastating gentleness, wiped the tears from her face with his thumb. "I've always known sign language, Brooklyn," he whispered, "since that first day. I understood every word you tried to tell me through gestures, every silent question, every mute thank you. I just didn't know how to tell you without seeming like I was hiding something." Brooklyn gestured quickly in sign language, her hands forming the words her heart had kept for so long. "I fell in love with you. I don't know exactly when, but it happened. And when I thought you hated me, that you'd never believe the babies were it destroyed me." Ryan caught her hands in the air, holding them against his chest where she could feel his heart beating rapidly. "I want to believe, Brooklyn," he gestured back, fluent and natural in sign language. "Every part of me wants to believe these babies are mine, that night, that it was real. But I'm so afraid. Afraid to believe and then find out I was wrong. Afraid that you deserve someone better than a broken man who can't even give you what you deserve." "You're not broken," Brooklyn gestured emphatically, "and you've already given me more than anyone. You saw me when I was invisible. You learned my language when no one else cared. You're exactly what I deserve because you're everything I want." Ryan let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled Brooklyn into an embrace, the first true, intentional embrace between them. She melted against his chest, feeling the strong arms envelop her, his chin resting on top of her head. They stayed like this for long minutes, the aquatic world spinning around them, oblivious to the other visitors passing through the glass tunnel. When they finally separated, Ryan held Brooklyn's face between his hands, his thumbs caressing her still wet cheeks. "Let's start over," he gestured, his grey eyes shining with uncontained emotion. "No secrets, no misunderstandings. I want to truly know you. I want to learn every part of you, and I want to be here. For you, for the babies. No matter whose they are, I'll love them because they're yours." Brooklyn nodded, smiling through the tears, and gestured back. "They're yours, Ryan, I promise. That night, you woke up. Maybe only for moments, but you saw me, recognized me, wanted me. And I couldn't resist. I couldn't resist you." Ryan closed his eyes, breathing deeply, as if trying to absorb the truth of those words. When he opened them again, there was a decision there, a conscious choice to believe, to trust, to surrender to that terrifying and wonderful possibility that maybe, just maybe, miracles were possible. "Then let's find out together," he said, alternating between gesturing and speaking. "Let's do this right this time." And there in the glass tunnel, surrounded by the simulated ocean, with life moving around them in ancient and patient patterns, Brooklyn and Ryan allowed themselves to believe that maybe it wasn't too late, that maybe the love that had begun with a lost girl and a kind young man could finally have the chance to bloom. The drive back to the villa was completely different from the way there. Where before there had been silence loaded with unresolved tension, now there was a comfortable intimacy. Intertwined hands resting on the center console, exchanged glances that lasted precious seconds before Ryan needed to return his attention to the road, small and genuine smiles that transformed both their faces. Brooklyn felt as if a layer of ice that had enveloped her heart for months had finally melted, and the warmth that took its place was both frightening and exquisitely comforting. When they arrived at the property, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that reflected on the house windows like soft flames. Ryan turned off the engine, but neither of them moved to get out. They sat in the growing silence of approaching night, still holding hands, as if breaking that contact meant returning to the reality they'd temporarily left behind. "Brooklyn," Ryan finally said, his voice low and hoarse, loaded with emotion. He turned in his seat to face her completely, his grey eyes shining with the golden light of sunset. "I know there's still a lot to resolve, many conversations we need to have, many wounds that need to heal, but I need you to know something." He took both her hands, bringing them to his lips and kissing her knuckles with a tenderness that made Brooklyn's heart race. "I'm sorry for not believing you, for sending you away, for every harsh word I said, every cold look I gave. You deserved so much more than that." Brooklyn freed one hand to gesture. "You were protecting your heart. I understand. I was also afraid." "But you shouldn't be afraid," Ryan gestured back, the fluency in sign language he'd hidden for so long now flowing naturally. "Not with me, never with me. I want to be the place where you feel safe, not the place you need to hide from." He leaned closer, and Brooklyn could feel his warmth, the scent of cedar, and something indefinable that was uniquely Ryan. Can I kiss you? For real this time? Not feverish, not unconscious, but completely present and wanting this more than anything?" In response, Brooklyn closed the distance between them, pressing her lips against his in a kiss that was both answer and question, promise and plea. Ryan let out a low sound deep in his throat, surprise, relief, desire, and deepened the kiss, one hand rising to intertwine in her hair, the other caressing her face with a reverence that made her feel precious, valued, loved. When they finally separated, both were breathless, faces flushed, eyes shining. "Let's go inside," Ryan whispered against her lips, "before I completely lose control here in the car." They got out of the vehicle and walked to the house, but this time Ryan didn't go to the guest room he normally occupied. Instead, he followed Brooklyn to her main bedroom, the silent question hovering between them. At the door, she turned, looked at him and nodded, a permission, an invitation, a shared desire. The room was bathed in the soft twilight light entering through the open windows, white linen curtains dancing softly with the night breeze that brought the scent of lavender from the garden. Ryan closed the door behind him, and for a moment they just stood there looking at each other. The reality of the moment settling, conscious, intentional, completely theirs. Ryan took the first step, walking to Brooklyn with measured steps, his eyes never leaving hers. When he stood before her, he raised his hands and, with a deliberate slowness that made each second stretch into sweet eternity, began undoing the buttons of her blouse. One by one, revealing inches of skin, he followed with soft kisses. On the collarbone, in the space between her breasts, just below the neck where her pulse beat rapidly. "You're so beautiful," he whispered against her skin, alternating between spoken words and gestures when he needed both hands. "You always have been. From that 7-year-old girl with frightened eyes until now, carrying life inside you. Every version of you is perfect." Brooklyn felt herself melt under his attention, under touches that were both gentle and hungry, reverent and urgent. She pulled his shirt out of his pants, her fingers working the buttons with less grace but equal determination. When she finally managed to open it completely, she slid her hands over his bare chest, tracing defined muscles, the old scar she'd already touched once before on that feverish night that had changed everything. Ryan took her hands, pressing them against his heart where she could feel the accelerated rhythm. "Do you feel this?" he asked, his eyes diving into hers. "Do you feel how my heart races when you touch me? How it recognizes you in ways my mind took so long to accept?" She nodded, tears already forming, tears of relief, of joy, of emotion so intense it overflowed. Ryan cleaned each tear with soft kisses, then captured her lips again in a deep kiss that stole the air from her lungs and made her legs weaken. They moved to the bed, an uncoordinated dance of intertwined limbs and clothes being removed with growing urgency. When they were finally skin against skin, Ryan paused, looking at Brooklyn's body with an expression that mixed desire and admiration. His hand descended softly to her rounded belly, fingers tracing the curve with a delicacy that contradicted the intensity in his eyes. "May I?" he asked, and Brooklyn knew he was asking permission for more than just touching. He was asking to really believe, to really accept that those lives growing there were part of him. "Please," she gestured, covering his hand with hers. "They're yours, Ryan, ours." Something broke in his eyes, the last barrier of resistance, the last shadow of doubt, and when he kissed her again, there was a total surrender there that didn't exist before. He kissed his way down, stopping at her belly to press soft kisses and whisper words too low to be clearly heard. But Brooklyn knew by the tone, by the raw emotion in his voice, that he was talking to the babies, making promises, offering love before even meeting them. When their mouths met again, there was an urgency that could no longer be contained. Ryan positioned himself over her, supporting his weight on his elbows to not press on her belly, his eyes asking one last time. Brooklyn pulled him closer, carefully wrapping her legs around him, and when they finally joined, both let out sounds of relief and pleasure that echoed in the silent room. It was completely different from that first night, Where before there had been confusion and fever, now there was clarity and intention. Where before there had been desperate urgency, now there was a slow and deliberate dance of giving and receiving. Ryan moved with conscious care, always attentive to her comfort, pausing frequently to kiss her deeply, to whisper words of adoration against her sweaty skin. "Brooklyn," he breathed against her ear, his voice hoarse and broken. "Tell me with your body what you feel for me." In response, she intertwined her fingers in his hair, pulling him into a kiss that was answer enough. Deep, desperate, full of all the love she couldn't say aloud. Their bodies found a rhythm that was uniquely theirs, building in growing waves of pleasure and connection. Ryan rested his forehead against hers, his eyes open and fixed on hers, even as pleasure increased. "Look at me," he whispered. "I want to see you. I want you to see me." And she looked, dove into the grey eyes that had been cold for so long, but now burned with an intensity that made her feel like she was being seen for the first time. Really seen, completely. When climax hit them, it was together. Synchronized waves of pleasure that left them trembling and gasping, tears mixing on the skin where their faces pressed. Afterward, Ryan carefully pulled her into his arms, adjusting her on her side so her belly was comfortable, intertwining his legs with hers, one arm wrapped protectively around her body. He kissed the top of her head, her shoulder, any piece of skin within reach, as if he couldn't stop touching her, assuring himself she was real. "I can't hide anymore," Ryan whispered in the growing darkness of the room, his voice vibrating against her back. "I want you, Brooklyn. I've always wanted you. Since that day at the station when you were 7, and I was an idiot teenager who didn't know he'd just met the love of his life. Every day since then has been a journey back to you, even when I didn't know it." Brooklyn turned in his arms to face him, silent tears streaming down her face. She gestured slowly. "I love you too. I don't know when it started. If it was the first time you held my hand when I slipped on the stairs, or when you brought books because you noticed I liked to read, or maybe it was years ago when a kind young man saved me when I was lost. But it's here, Ryan. This love is here, real and immense and scary." Ryan held her face between his hands, his thumbs caressing her wet cheeks. "Don't be afraid," he gestured back. "Not anymore. We'll face everything together. Every challenge, every doubt, every moment of uncertainty, together." He pulled her closer, intertwining their bodies so there was no space between them, and whispered against her hair, "I'll never leave you, Brooklyn. Never. You're mine, and I'm yours. And whatever comes next, we'll face it side by side." Brooklyn nestled against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, feeling his warmth heating every part of her body. For the first time since discovering the pregnancy, since the devastating confrontation, since all the months of loneliness and fear, she felt something she thought she'd never feel again: hope. And as she fell asleep in the arms of the man she loved, his hands resting protectively on the belly where their children were growing, Brooklyn allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. But there was still a storm forming on the horizon, a threat that neither of them saw approaching, and her name was Tina. The following months were the happiest of Brooklyn's life. Ryan had practically moved to the villa, working remotely and appearing in the city only for absolutely essential meetings. They spent their days together, morning walks through the fragrant garden, afternoons reading side by side on the porch, evenings talking in sign language about everything and nothing, building an intimacy that went far beyond the physical. Ryan learned to cook special dishes that didn't trigger her nausea, massaged her swollen feet every night, and talked to her belly constantly, telling stories about the world the babies would soon know. Brooklyn was in her 7th month of pregnancy when they received the news. It was time to return to the city. The doctor had recommended she spend the last trimester closer to the specialized hospital where the delivery would take place, especially since they were twins. Ryan agreed immediately, but promised it would be different this time. She wouldn't be hidden, wouldn't be treated like a shameful secret. She was his wife, and he was ready for the whole world to know. The return to the Miller mansion was surreal. The employees greeted them with renewed respect. News of the couple's reconciliation had spread, and there was an almost festive atmosphere on the property. Ryan had renovated Brooklyn's room, transforming it into a comfortable suite adjacent to his, with an attached nursery already prepared with 2 identical cribs, delicate mobiles, and walls painted in soft shades of mint green and pastel yellow. But not everything was perfect. Brooklyn noticed the looks on the streets when they went out to dinner. At social events Ryan now insisted she accompany him to, whispers that stopped abruptly when she approached, fake smiles that didn't reach the eyes. High society hadn't forgotten the scandal, and many still doubted the baby's paternity. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after their return, that the storm finally broke. Brooklyn was in the mansion garden, sitting on a bench under the shade of a cherry tree, knitting tiny booties when she heard voices coming from the main entrance. A female voice, loud and indignant, arguing with the security guards. Curious and slightly alarmed, Brooklyn got up with difficulty. Her belly was huge now, making every movement an effort, and walked toward the source of the disturbance. What she saw made her blood freeze. A woman stood at the entrance, beautiful in a sharp and dangerous way, perfectly styled blonde hair, wearing an expensive white suit that screamed money and power, and blue eyes that gleamed with barely contained rage. She was pushing the guards who tried to block her, shouting that she had every right to see Ryan, that he couldn't just ignore her after everything they'd shared. "Where is she?" the woman demanded, her voice echoing through the garden. "Where's the little imposter who seduced Ryan? Who pretended to be pregnant with children that obviously aren't his?" Brooklyn froze, instantly recognizing who this woman was. Tina Morrison, Ryan's ex-girlfriend, the woman everyone expected him to marry before the agreement with the Chen family had changed everything. She'd seen photos in society magazines, heard the name whispered in conversations that stopped when she entered. Tina was from high society, from an old and respected family. Exactly the type of woman everyone thought Ryan should have chosen. "You don't have permission to be here, Miss Morrison," one of the guards said firmly, blocking her way. "Mr. Miller was clear about this." "Clear?" Tina laughed, a high-pitched sound without humor. "He's being manipulated. This mute woman got him involved in some kind of farce, and I won't stand by while his reputation is destroyed." That's when she saw Brooklyn, standing on the stone path, one hand supporting her prominent belly. Tina's eyes narrowed, and a cruel smile curved her red-painted lips. "There you are," she said, walking toward Brooklyn with determined steps, her high heels clicking threateningly against the stones. "The little silent wife. You think you're smart, don't you? Think you can trap Ryan with a fake pregnancy?" Brooklyn instinctively stepped back, but Tina followed her, getting too close, invading her personal space. "I know your game. Ryan is sterile. Everyone knows that. So whose babies are those, really? Which man did you sleep with while pretending to be the faithful, obedient wife?" Brooklyn tried to gesture, tried to explain, but Tina slapped her hands away forcefully. "Don't give me your little hands. You may fool Ryan with this helpless victim act, but I know the truth. You're an opportunist. That's enough." Ryan's voice cut through the air like a blade, cold and absolutely terrifying in its controlled quietness. He had emerged from the house wearing casual clothes, but with an expression that was pure ice. In 2 long strides, he was between Brooklyn and Tina, one arm extended protectively back to keep Brooklyn safe behind him. "Ryan!" Tina immediately changed her tone, her voice becoming soft, almost tearful. "Thank God you're here. I was so worried about you. Everyone is talking, saying terrible things about how you're being manipulated." "Leave," Ryan said, each word articulated with deadly precision. "Leave my property now." "But Ryan, I just want to help. Don't you see? She's using you. Those babies can't be yours, and when the DNA test proves it, you'll be devastated. Let me protect you from this." "Protect." Ryan took a step forward, and even Tina stepped back before the contained fury in his eyes. "You want to protect me? Where were you when I was building my company from scratch, working 18 hours a day? Where were you when I had the accident that almost killed me? Oh yes, you were in Paris with the Whitmore heir, weren't you?" Tina paled. That was a misunderstanding. You left me when you thought I'd never be anything," Ryan continued, his voice getting lower but more dangerous. "You came back only when I became successful. And now you have the audacity to come here, to my home, insult my wife, question my children. But Ryan, be rational, you're sterile. How can those babies..." The doctors were wrong, Ryan interrupted, and there was absolute conviction in his voice. It happens. Medicine isn't infallible. And even if they weren't mine biologically, even if Brooklyn had adopted these babies, they'd still be mine because any child she loves, I love. Brooklyn felt tears burn her eyes, hearing those words. Ryan looked back, his eyes meeting hers for a moment, a silent communication passing between them. I believe you. I choose you. Always. Tina let out a frustrated sound. You're being an idiot. Everyone knows the truth. Your wife is probably sleeping with half the world while you work. Careful, Ryan said, and there was something so dangerous in his voice that Tina finally stopped talking. You can insult me all you want, but say one more word against Brooklyn, and I'll personally ensure that every door in society closes for you and your family. Don't test me, Tina. You wouldn't win. It was at that moment that Brooklyn made a decision. She'd been passive for too long, letting others speak for her, fight for her. It was time to fight for herself. With trembling hands, she pulled her phone from her pocket and opened the recording app. She'd started recording the moment Tina began shouting at the entrance, an instinct of self-preservation. She touched Ryan's shoulder, getting his attention, and showed him the phone. His eyes widened when he saw the recording still running, capturing every venomous word Tina had said. A slow, almost predatory smile appeared on Ryan's face. He gestured to Brooklyn in sign language. You recorded everything? She nodded, a small, triumphant smile touching her lips for the first time since Tina had appeared. Ryan turned back to Tina, who looked confused between the two. You know, he said casually, as if discussing the weather, defamation is a serious crime, especially when there's video evidence of false accusations. Tina paled. You wouldn't dare... Try me, Ryan said softly. One word from you against Brooklyn in society, even a whisper, and this video goes to every newspaper, every magazine, every influential person in this city. Your reputation will be destroyed before you can blink. You choose her over me? Tina asked, and for the first time there was genuine vulnerability in her voice, as if she really couldn't comprehend. Over everything we could have been. There's no choice, Ryan responded, and his voice softened just a fraction. It was always her, Tina. Since I was 16 and saved a lost girl at the train station, I just didn't know it yet. Tina looked at Brooklyn with something that was part hatred, part envy, and part surprisingly reluctant respect. You won, she said quietly. But this isn't over. When those babies are born, when the DNA test proves... The DNA test will prove they're mine, a new voice interrupted. And everyone turned to see Ryan's grandfather, the Miller family patriarch, walking toward them, leaning on an ornate cane. Charles Miller was 85 years old, but his eyes were sharp and penetrating, missing nothing. Because I already did the test. Brooklyn's heart stopped. Ryan turned completely to his grandfather. What? Charles stopped before them, looking directly at Brooklyn with an expression that was hard to decipher. When you were at the villa, he said, addressing her, your obstetrician sent me regular medical reports. During one of the ultrasounds, they collected samples for genetic testing. It's standard procedure for twin pregnancies. I asked them to compare with Ryan's DNA from our family medical file. He paused dramatically, and Brooklyn felt like she was going to faint. Ryan held her hand, squeezing hard. The results came back 2 weeks ago. Charles continued, 99.99% match. Both babies are biologically Ryan's. The silence that followed was absolute. Tina stood open-mouthed. Ryan turned to Brooklyn, his eyes wide with shock and joy. And Brooklyn simply collapsed in tears of relief, her legs giving way under the weight of months of tension finally released. Ryan caught her before she fell, pulling her into a tight embrace, murmuring repeatedly against her hair, I knew. I'm sorry I ever doubted. Charles turned to Tina with an icy look. As for you, Miss Morrison, I suggest you leave this property immediately and never return. The Miller family doesn't tolerate defamation against members of our family. And Brooklyn, he looked at his granddaughter-in-law with something that seemed like approval, is definitely part of this family. Tina opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water, then, realizing she was completely defeated, turned and rushed away, her heels clicking her humiliating retreat. When she was gone, Charles approached Brooklyn and Ryan, placing a heavy hand on his grandson's shoulder. You have my blessing, he said simply, "and my protection. Anyone who dares question the legitimacy of these children will have to deal with me personally." He looked directly at Brooklyn's belly, and a rare, genuine smile softened his aged face. "Miller heirs, finally. With the family eyes. You can already see it in the ultrasounds." Then, with a nod, he walked away, leaving Brooklyn and Ryan alone in the garden, still embracing, processing everything that had just happened. "It's true," Brooklyn gestured through tears. "Really true. Do you believe now?" "I believed when you told me," Ryan gestured back, holding her face. "The rest of the world needed proof. I only needed you." They stayed like this for long minutes, holding each other under the cherry tree, while the afternoon sun gilded everything around them. The storm had passed, and finally, they could breathe. The twins' birth happened on a spring morning, when the world seemed to be awakening with renewed colors and fresh promises. Brooklyn went into labor at 5 in the morning, waking Ryan with a gentle touch on his shoulder and an urgent gesture. He jumped out of bed instantly, transforming into the efficient man of action who commanded a billion-dollar empire. But his hands trembled as he helped Brooklyn get dressed, and she saw the naked fear in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. The delivery lasted 8 hours. 8 hours during which Ryan never let go of her hand, never left her side, gesturing words of encouragement in sign language, wiping her sweaty face, being her anchor when the pain threatened to drag her away. And when finally, the first cries filled the delivery room, Brooklyn saw tears openly stream down Ryan's face, no attempt to hide or contain them. "A boy," the doctor announced, placing the tiny red baby on Brooklyn's chest. He was perfect, small, wrinkled, with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that blinked confused at the new, bright world. Brooklyn looked at him with absolute wonder, unable to process that this tiny being had grown inside her, that he was half her and half the man she loved. "And here comes number 2, the doctor said moments later. And soon there was another baby, a girl this time, slightly smaller than her brother, but with equally powerful lungs, protesting indignantly against the abrupt transition from the comfort of the womb to the cold of the outside world. Ryan held both babies when the nurses cleaned and wrapped them, one in each arm, and Brooklyn had never seen an expression of love so pure and devastating as the one that illuminated his face at that moment. He looked at her over the twins' little heads and gestured with difficulty, balancing the babies. "Thank you for them, for giving me a family, for making me believe in miracles," Brooklyn cried, tears of exhaustion and joy mixing on her cheeks, and gestured back. "Thank you for never really giving up on me, even when you should have." They named the boy Ethan, a name that meant strong and firm, and the girl Lily, delicate and beautiful like the flower. Ethan had Ryan's gray eyes, while Lily inherited Brooklyn's dark brown eyes, but both had the same determined expression their parents shared, already evident even on such young faces. The following days were a blur of diapers, feedings every 3 hours, sleepless nights, and an exhaustion Brooklyn never imagined possible. But through all of it, Ryan was there, learning to change diapers with the same precision he used for multi-million-dollar deals, rocking Lily at 3 in the morning when she refused to sleep, whispering stories to Ethan while he cradled him. He hired the best nurses, but refused to delegate basic care. He wanted to be present, wanted to be a real father, not just a distant provider. It was a week after they left the hospital that Ryan did something unexpected. Brooklyn was in the baby's room watching them sleep in their cribs, a daily miracle that never ceased to amaze her, when Ryan entered silently, carrying a box of papers. He placed it on the changing table and pulled out an official envelope. Brooklyn recognized it immediately. These were the divorce papers he had prepared months ago, when he still believed the babies weren't his, when he planned to send her away after the birth. Ryan held the papers before her, and for one terrible moment, Brooklyn felt her heart stop. No, not now. Not after everything. But then Ryan began to tear. Slowly, deliberately, he tore each page into small pieces, his eyes never leaving hers. When he finished, he let the pieces fall like confetti around their feet and gestured, "I never should have prepared this. Never should have planned to let you go. You're my wife, Brooklyn. For real this time. Not out of obligation, not by family arrangement, because I choose you every day forever." Brooklyn sobbed silently, covering her mouth with her hands. Ryan continued, his own hands trembling slightly. If you want freedom, I'll give you the world. I'll make sure you have everything you need, you and the children. But if you want love, if you want to stay, build a real life with me, then I'm here, forever. No conditions, no doubts, no fears. Just us. Just us, Brooklyn gestured back, tears flowing freely now. I always wanted just us. Ryan pulled her into his arms, kissing her face, her hair, her lips, as if he couldn't stop. And when they finally separated, he pulled something else from his pocket. A small velvet box. Brooklyn looked at it with confusion. They were already married. She already wore a wedding band, a band that had been placed on her finger on a day that felt like a funeral, but that now carried a completely different meaning. Ryan opened the box, revealing a different ring, delicate, with a center stone that sparkled even in the soft light of the baby's room. This is different, he gestured. The first ring was placed out of obligation. This is my choice, my promise. Will you marry me again, Brooklyn? For real this time? With our children as witnesses, with our love as foundation? Brooklyn nodded so vigorously she almost got dizzy, extending her trembling hand. Ryan slid the new ring beside the old one, and somehow they looked perfect together. The past and present obligation transformed into choice, arrangement becoming true love. Months turned into years, and the life they built together became richer than either of them imagined possible. Brooklyn began working at her grandfather's Oriental medicine clinic, discovering she had a natural talent for healing. Her inability to speak forced her to really listen to patients, to pay attention to signs other doctors missed. She became especially known for working with children, who responded to her silent kindness in ways that surprised even experienced professionals. Ryan restructured his work life to be more present. He delegated more responsibilities, refused unnecessary trips, made sure he had dinner at home every night. He taught Ethan and Lily sign language from infancy, making it as natural as spoken language, ensuring they never saw their mother's silence as a limitation, but just as another form of communication. On the twins' 4th birthday, the Miller family organized a party in the mansion garden, the same garden where Brooklyn had felt so alone and lost years ago. But now it was full of children's laughter, colorful balloons tied to trees, the sound of genuine happiness echoing through the stone paths. Brooklyn was watching Ethan and Lily play with other children when she felt familiar arms wrap around her waist from behind. Ryan rested his chin on her shoulder, and together they watched their children, so alive, so healthy, so completely loved. Do you ever regret it? Brooklyn gestured playfully. Marrying the mute girl who couldn't even ask for help on her own? Ryan turned her in his arms, holding her face with both hands, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. I married the strongest woman I know, he gestured firmly, a woman who saved me when I didn't even know I needed to be saved, a woman who taught me that silence can speak louder than words, that vulnerability is courage, that love doesn't need a voice to be heard. He kissed her softly, then continued gesturing. You gave me everything, Brooklyn. A family, a purpose, a reason to be more than just successful, a reason to be good. How could I regret the best gift I ever received? Brooklyn leaned into him, and they stayed like this for long moments, holding each other while the world spun around them. Children laughing, music playing, the sweet smell of spring flowers in the air. Lily ran to them, pulling both their legs. Mommy, Daddy, come play, she shouted, then repeated in sign language when she saw her mother was watching. Come, play. Ryan and Brooklyn exchanged a look, one of those looks that couples develop over the years, full of silent communication and shared understanding, and smiled. Hand in hand, they followed their daughter to where Ethan waited for them, ready to start an elaborate game he had invented. That night, after the guests left and the children were put to bed, Brooklyn and Ryan sat together on the bench under the cherry tree, the same bench where so many things had changed between them, where whispers had turned into conversations, strangers into lovers, obligation into choice. Ryan pulled Brooklyn into his arms, and she nestled against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, a sound that had become her favorite music, her certainty when everything else seemed uncertain. Thank you. He gestured in the air where she could see, for not giving up on me when I gave up on us, for believing it was worth fighting for. even when I made it so difficult. Brooklyn turned in his arms, taking his face and forcing him to look directly at her. And then, for the first time since losing her voice at 6 years old, she tried to speak. Not gesture, not write, but really speak. "Ryan," she whispered, and the word came out hoarse, broken, barely audible, but it was a word, a real word, spoken aloud. Ryan froze, his eyes widening in absolute shock. "Brooklyn, did you just—" "I love you," she forced, each syllable a struggle, each sound a victory. The words were imperfect, but they were hers. "Always loved you." Tears streamed down Ryan's face without control. He kissed her deeply, desperately, and when they finally separated, he was laughing and crying at the same time. "Your voice," he gestured in wonder. "After all these years." "The doctor said it was psychological," Brooklyn gestured, returning to the more comfortable sign language. "The trauma made me lose my voice. But love, true love, real safety, maybe it can bring it back, little by little." "Don't rush," Ryan gestured, smiling through tears. "I learned to hear your silence. I learned you never really lost your voice. You just found different ways to use it, ways that taught me to really listen." They sat there until the stars emerged in the night sky, talking in silent gestures and occasional whispered words, building bridges between silence and sound, between past and future, between two people who had found each other when both were lost. And when they finally went into sleep, Ryan turned to Brooklyn one last time before darkness enveloped them completely. "Thank you," he whispered in the dark, "for loving me when I didn't even know how to love myself, for seeing goodness in me when all I showed was coldness, for making me a better man, a better father, a better person just by being at my side." Brooklyn took his hand in the darkness, intertwining their fingers, and squeezed 3 times, a language they had developed long ago. 3 squeezes, always 3. "I love you." And Ryan squeezed back 3 times, his silent response in the dark. "I love you too." Some loves begin with fire and passion, others begin with arrangements and obligations, but the best ones, the ones that truly last, begin with a choice. A choice made every day, in every small gesture, in every gentle touch, in every look that says, "I see you, I choose you, I love you." And Ryan and Brooklyn, they chose each other. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, forever. Brooklyn and Ryan's story reminds us that the greatest loves rarely begin with perfection. They begin with choices, choices made in the darkest moments, when it would be easier to give up. Brooklyn chose to believe that love could bloom even in barren soil. Ryan chose to trust when every logical reason said not to trust. And together, they transformed a forced marriage into a sanctuary of true love. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. Sometimes vulnerability is the greatest display of strength. And sometimes, those who save us are exactly the people who most need to be saved. Because in the end, love isn't about having all the answers. It's about choosing to stay, even in the questions. It's about building bridges where walls exist. It's about seeing the person behind the silence and saying, "I see you. I choose you. You are enough." And maybe that's what we're all looking for. Someone who chooses us not despite our flaws but including them. Someone who transforms our scars into survival stories and our fears into opportunities for courage. Do you also have the courage to choose love, even when it seems impossible? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and become a member to get early access to upcoming stories. Comment where you're listening from. We love knowing our stories reach hearts around the world. And if you felt it was really worth listening to, also click the Super Thanks button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us continue bringing stories that move you.